watching Biography of the Millennium on A&E. Here's where we stand in our countdown of the most influential people of the last 1,000 years.
If this too solid flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew, or that the everlasting had not fixed his cannon against self-slaughter, oh God.
I would put Shakespeare very high on the list because the soul of mankind matters as much as the science of the universe, and Shakespeare held the soul of mankind in his hands.
He is the world's most famous writer, and yet we know very little about him. William Shakespeare, number 5, would have appreciated that irony. Few artists had such a subtle grasp of the human heart and such a rich command of the tales he wove.
One is tempted to say that Shakespeare was the greatest writer who ever lived or ever could live, because it's almost unimaginable that the wits of the genius could ever be matched again. He's an extraordinary constructor of plots, extraordinary psychologist, a great myth maker, but the language above all, I suppose, is what establishes him as just the leading writer of the world, to me.
He came to London from the English countryside, and by 1592 he was crafting a successful career as an actor, author, and poet. His performances took him from the stage of the Globe Theatre to the court of Queen Elizabeth. He captivated audiences, although at the time he was considered an untutored genius, a little rough around the edges. A century later, the full measure of his achievement would be acknowledged. For in some 154 sonnets and 38 plays, through Othello and Lear and Richard III, Shakespeare created a timeless dramatic mirror of the way we live.
When we see a young man incapable of making a decision, an important decision, we think Hamlet. When we see an old man who is turned upon by his children and feels that his life has been worthless, we think of Lear. When we think of lovers, we think of Romeo and Juliet, and so on and so on and so on. You cannot name another writer who has created the models for the way we think as Shakespeare.
Today, the works of Shakespeare are performed more than any other playwright. His plays are transformed into musicals, operas, ballets, and of course, movies, for they are the inspiration we return to again and again.
I suppose if someone could name me a film that didn't draw directly from Shakespeare, I would think that that person was the next William Shakespeare. Because I think every plot, every story that anyone tells pretty much falls in step with the plots that Shakespeare invented. All of us, you know, have William Shakespeare to thank.
Shakespeare's works invite imitation. They almost beg for it.
Two Gentlemen of Malibu. Have you ever heard that one? That's... Oh, yet this simple wave will break slowly, yet not knowing why. Oh, boogie on, this not knowing this thing I do call thee friend, wax my board, and not know who thee are. Oh, gentle Richard, would that I had not known why. I don't care. It'd be great to think if Shakespeare could write Richard IV, you know. I'm not willing, trapped before my time, sent undine and not knowing. Ill laughed, and they do laugh at my shadow. I'm not a crook, yet knowing this, I will splice until dawn and walk towards the copter unknown.
The richness of Shakespeare's inspiration, the complexity of his works, has led some people to ask, how could the son of a glove maker who never traveled beyond England be the author of such exquisite words? Some claim that Shakespeare was a front for a man of more noble birth who wished to be anonymous. One of the suspects is our number 38, Sir Francis Bacon.
Well, they also think it's not just Francis Bacon. It's like, or the Earl of Oxford, you know. There's a huge debate about that. I mean, here's the deal. You basically think of, you know, at that time, look in the plays. There's incredible references in Latin, Greek, travel. I mean, the scope is global. And yet, you know, it's, if you think of its will, just wandering around, knocking on doors in Stratford, going, is this to be or not to be?
But in the end, perhaps it really doesn't matter who wrote Shakespeare's words, for they are powerful and they endure.
Those plays what are they, 500 years old now, continue to work. And they continue to work visually, theatrically, and personally. You know, Hamlet, we know exactly who that is. And Lear, and also that range of what it is to be young and narcissistic and self-indulgent and what it is to be old and knowing it's over. And to be able to touch the heart that deeply.
Will Shakespeare live on forever? Yes, Shakespeare, you know, will certainly live beyond, I think, most of the people on this list.
He trained to be a doctor, but couldn't stand watching surgery. He studied to be a clergyman, but that didn't work out either. Instead, he ended up shocking the world with an idea, an hypothesis of where we all come from. Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution.
In spite of my formal training in physics and my love of Galileo and Copernicus, I might just put Charles Darwin a notch above each of them. Because the Darwinian evolution affects human beings and the knowledge of where we came from much more directly than Galileo or even Copernicus or Einstein.
It was a discovery that almost didn't happen. When the British Royal Navy planned a scientific expedition, Darwin was offered a position as naturalist. His father didn't want him to go. The captain wasn't eager to have him along either, but at the last minute, Darwin went aboard. As the HMS Beagle traveled down the coast of South America, the young man marveled at the incredible variety of plants and animals he saw.
Here was an individual who fundamentally looked at the world. He didn't have elaborate instrumentation. He wasn't looking out at the stars. He wasn't looking with a microscope into the cell. He was just looking.
It was while observing the birds of the Galapagos Islands that Darwin made his most famous discovery. He counted 13 different types of finch on separate islands, some with long beaks, some with short ones, all sorts of variations. He wondered if nature had, over generations, adjusted the finches in varying ways to cope with their surroundings.
He began to come up with the idea of natural selection, that species tend to perish if they're not well adapted to their environment, and they tend to thrive and reproduce if they are.
It was, Darwin reasoned, the survival of the fittest, or the swiftest, the one with the longest neck or sharpest beak. Over thousands and thousands of years, that was the way species evolved. Darwin kept researching until he was 50. In 1859, he finally published Origin of Species, which laid out his theory of evolution. The book sold out in a day, and the controversy began. In 19th century Victorian England, the book of Genesis was gospel, and the gospel said that God created Earth's creatures. Evolution seemed to fly right in the face of the Bible. The commotion would only grow louder when Darwin announced that the human species was a product of the evolutionary process too. That man was descended from apes and monkeys was an almost unthinkable notion in Darwin's day.
The concept of the thought of evolving from some substandard creature, or what you think to be substandard, is almost an insult to people. And you know, a lot of people don't want to hear that. And sorry, but that's the way it is.
Today, Darwin's ideas are widely accepted, and yet they remain controversial. For they permanently dethroned man from his central place in the history of the Earth.
Go now, because I've realized essentially, look, Darwin was wrong. I've got to get these gloves back to a gorilla.